When Nora Bell walked through the tall iron gates of the youth rehabilitation shelter for the first time, she could feel the weight of the place before she even saw it. The air smelled faintly of bleach and old paint, and the sound of shouting echoed down the hall. It wasn't anger exactly. It was the kind of noise that came from people who had forgotten how to speak softly. The walls were covered in chipped posters about respect and teamwork, but the graffiti scratched across them told a different story. Nora stopped for a moment, taking it all in. She had been warned before she took the job. "They're not like normal kids," one of the older counselors had said. "They're too wild to save. You'll see." But she didn't believe that. She had worked in shelters before, seen how pain hides itself behind noise. These kids weren't monsters. They were survivors who had learned to roar because no one listened when they whispered. The first thing she noticed when she stepped inside was how cold it felt, not just in temperature but in spirit. Staff members moved quickly, heads down, doing their work with the tired rhythm of people who had stopped hoping for change. A guard at the door nodded at her and said, "Good luck in there, counselor. They eat new ones alive." His tone was half joking, half serious. She smiled politely, though her heart was beating faster. As she walked down the long hall toward the common room, the noise grew louder. Footsteps, laughter, a slammed door. When she reached the end of the hall, she saw them for the first time, about a dozen teens, sitting at tables, sprawled on couches, some arguing, some staring blankly into space. They were between 13 and 17, all wearing the same gray clothes, all with that same restless energy in their eyes. The staff called them predator cubs. Nora had overheard the term during orientation. It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was just how the workers described kids who bit back, kids who scared them. But when she looked at them, she didn't see predators. She saw exhaustion. She saw fear hiding behind defiance. She saw bruised hearts that no one had cared to heal. As she stepped into the room, a few of them looked up. One boy nudged another and whispered something that made the group snicker. A girl sitting near the window rolled her eyes and said, "Another one? She won't last a week." Nora smiled softly. "Maybe," she said, "but I'm here today." That caught their attention. No one had expected her to answer like that. She introduced herself and told them she wasn't there to fix them, just to listen. That seemed to confuse them more than anything. They weren't used to adults who listened without judgment. The rest of the day was chaotic. Arguments, interruptions, sarcasm, but she didn't lose her calm. When one boy cursed loudly just to see her reaction, she didn't send him out. She simply said, "You sound angry. Want to tell me why?" He didn't answer, just looked away, but she caught something in his eyes. Surprise. No one had asked him why before. By the time her first day ended, Nora was exhausted. Her voice was hoarse, her hands trembling slightly, but she stayed until the last student left the room. She gathered her papers, glanced around at the empty chairs, and whispered to herself, "They just need time." As she walked out, one of the older counselors shook her head. "You'll see," she said. "They don't change." Nora didn't argue. She just smiled faintly and replied, "Maybe no one stayed long enough to notice." That night, lying in bed, she replayed the day in her mind, the shouting, the mocking smiles, the one moment of quiet when they had all stopped to listen. It was small, barely a spark, but she felt it. Change wouldn't come fast, and it wouldn't come easy, but she wasn't afraid of the noise. She understood it. Under all the anger, she had heard something else, a silence waiting to be filled with understanding. And that, she thought, was where she'd start. The first week tested every bit of Nora's patience. Each morning, she walked into the common room with her folder, her coffee, and a small, determined smile. Each morning, she was met with the same reaction: blank stares, eye rolls, and a few snickers from the corner. The group sessions she planned so carefully went nowhere. When she asked questions about their goals, no one answered. When she tried to talk about trust, they laughed. It wasn't mean laughter, not really. It was the sound of kids who didn't believe in that word anymore. They had been promised trust too many times and seen it break every time. One boy sat at the back every day, arms folded, staring at her with the kind of challenge that said, "Let's see how long you last." Another made jokes under his breath, trying to make the others laugh while she spoke. They weren't cruel. They were testing her, like animals, sniffing out whether someone was dangerous or safe. Nora understood that. Still, it was hard not to feel defeated when every word she said seemed to bounce off a wall. By the middle of the week, she had tried everything: games, stories, group activities, but nothing worked. They talked over her, ignored her questions, or sat in silence so heavy it was almost worse than the noise. At one point, during a discussion about anger, a boy suddenly stood up, picked up a book from the table, and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a loud thud and fell open on the floor. The room froze. Everyone turned to her, waiting. This was the moment they had seen before, where the teacher, counselor, or volunteer snapped. Some shouted. Some stormed out. A few even quit on the spot. Nora didn't move right away. She just looked at the boy, calm but steady. Then she walked over, picked up the book, brushed the dust off, and placed it back on the shelf. Her voice was quiet but clear. "I'll be here again tomorrow," she said simply, then turned back to the group. No lecture, no anger, no punishment. Just that one line. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the bored silence she had heard all week. It was something else. Confusion, maybe. No one knew what to make of her. She didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't call for a guard. She just stayed. A few of them exchanged glances, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But nothing happened. She continued the session like it hadn't been interrupted. When the day ended, the kids left slowly, still glancing at her as if they were trying to figure her out. One of the girls muttered, "She's weird," and someone else replied, "Yeah, but she's not like the others." Nora overheard it but said nothing. She just smiled faintly to herself. That night, as she packed up her things, one of the older counselors stopped by her desk. "Rough day?" they asked. Nora shrugged. "They're still watching me," she said. "Trying to see if I'll leave." The counselor chuckled. "You probably will. Everyone does." Nora met their eyes and said quietly, "Not tomorrow." She went home tired, her head pounding from the noise, but there was a tiny flicker of warmth in her chest. It wasn't victory. It was something softer, something like hope. For the first time that week, she had seen their masks slip just for a second. She had seen confusion in their eyes when she didn't explode like everyone else. That confusion meant she'd done something new, something unexpected. The next morning, when she walked back into the room, they looked up. No one said good morning, but they didn't laugh either. It wasn't trust yet, but it was a start. And Nora knew one thing with quiet certainty: change doesn't begin with speeches or lessons. It begins with showing up, again and again, until someone realizes you're not going anywhere. Weeks turned into months, and the noise inside the shelter began to sound different to Nora. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was a rhythm she could almost understand. The same shouts, the same laughter, even the same arguments. But beneath it, there was a kind of familiarity now. She had learned their habits, their moods, their unspoken language. She began to see patterns, the kind that only appear when you care enough to look. There was one boy who always sat in the back, shoulders tense, eyes flicking toward the door whenever someone raised their voice. He pretended not to care about anything, but Nora noticed how his hands shook slightly whenever a guard shouted in the hall. She started speaking softer around him, choosing her words carefully, never forcing him to talk. Then there was the girl with the permanent scowl, who seemed ready to fight anyone who looked at her for too long. One afternoon, when the others were busy arguing, Nora caught her quietly reading a small, torn notebook under the table. For a moment, their eyes met, and the girl froze, expecting to be called out. But Nora only smiled and said, "You've got good taste in poetry." The girl blinked in surprise, closed the book slowly, and didn't say a word. But the next day, she came in early and sat closer to the front. Every student had something hidden behind their mask: fear, guilt, longing. They weren't bad kids. They were broken in small, quiet ways that no one had ever taken the time to understand. Some never looked her in the eye. Some pretended they didn't hear her when she asked questions. But Nora never stopped trying. Every day she talked to them, even when they didn't answer. Sometimes she would tell small stories from her own life, stories about mistakes, loss, and second chances. She didn't do it to win their sympathy. She did it to remind them that being human wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying again. At first, they acted like they didn't care. They rolled their eyes or looked away, but she could tell they were listening. The silence after she spoke wasn't rejection anymore. It was thought. They were processing, testing the idea that maybe, just maybe, not every adult was there to judge them. Nora noticed little changes. One boy started greeting her in the mornings, barely audible but enough to count. Another stopped interrupting her during group sessions. The laughter that used to mock her now sounded softer. Real laughter, not cruel or defensive. There were still hard days, of course. Some mornings the room felt heavy with tension, and she wondered if she was making any difference at all. But then something small would happen. A smile, a question, a quiet, "Thank you." And she would remember why she stayed. Change wasn't loud here. It was slow and quiet, like ice melting after a long winter. One rainy afternoon, she sat with the group as they filled out a writing exercise. The room was unusually calm. Papers rustled, pencils scratched, and no one was shouting. Nora watched them in silence, her heart full. These were the same kids who had once thrown books, screamed insults, and refused to listen. Now they were working. Not perfectly, not all the time, but they were trying. When the session ended, a few of them lingered by the door. The tough girl who read poetry stopped and said, almost in a whisper, "That poem you told us yesterday. It was nice." Then she left before Nora could reply. It wasn't much, but to Nora it was everything. That night, as she locked her office and turned off the lights, Nora thought about how people always said the kids at the shelter had walls around them. It was true. But what most didn't realize was that walls weren't built to keep people out. They were built to see who cared enough to climb over. And slowly, quietly, she was climbing. The night the power went out was one Nora would never forget. Winter had hit the town harder than usual, and the shelter's old heating system was already struggling. By evening, the wind howled outside like a living thing, pushing against the thin windows, and snow covered the streets in thick, heavy layers. Most of the staff had gone home early, their faces tired from another long day. Only a few volunteers stayed behind, bundled in coats, doing their best to keep things running. Nora stayed too. She told herself she needed to finish her reports, but deep down, she knew she couldn't leave the kids. Not that night. By the time the power finally failed, the sun was gone, and the shelter sank into darkness. The lights flickered twice, then went out completely, leaving the halls filled with the faint sound of confusion and the distant moan of the wind. Someone found a flashlight, another lit a few candles from the supply closet, but it wasn't enough to warm the cold creeping in through the cracks. The kids were restless, huddling under thin blankets, their laughter loud and nervous. They teased each other to hide the fact that they were uncomfortable, maybe even a little scared. The storm outside seemed endless, and the night felt longer than any before it. Nora sat at her small desk near the corner of the common room, using a flashlight to read over her papers. The beam wobbled slightly in her hand as she wrote down notes about progress reports and behavior logs. Her fingers were cold, and her breath fogged faintly in the air. Every now and then, she'd glance up to check on the kids. Some were sitting together on the floor, whispering jokes, while others lay curled up, pretending to sleep. She could see their faces in the dim light. The same faces that once glared at her in anger now looked softer, younger somehow. One of the boys noticed her and whispered to another, "Why is she still here?" The second shrugged. "Maybe she's stuck too." Nora heard them but didn't say anything. She smiled quietly and kept working, her pen scratching gently on the paper. She didn't want them to think she was watching over them because she had to. She stayed because she wanted to. As the hours passed, the room grew colder. Even with the blankets, the chill seeped through everything, through skin, through walls, through nerves. Nora pulled her coat tighter but stayed where she was, focused on her work. Her flashlight beam caught the edge of the paper, trembling slightly as her hand began to shake from the cold. A part of her wanted to go home, to crawl into a warm bed and forget the storm. But another part, the stronger one, reminded her that the kids couldn't leave. They didn't have homes to go back to. She wasn't going to leave them alone in the dark. Every now and then, one of them would glance her way. They didn't speak, but their eyes followed her quietly. They saw the way she rubbed her hands together, trying to warm them, and how her shoulders trembled under her thin sweater. Yet she didn't complain. She didn't make a scene. She just stayed, calm, steady, and present. That mattered more than she knew. At one point, a gust of wind rattled the window so hard that a few of the kids jumped. Nora looked up and said gently, "It's just the storm. We're safe here." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried across the room. For a moment, the teasing stopped and the laughter faded. The sound of the storm filled the silence between them. They went back to their whispering soon after, but something had shifted. Maybe it was the way she didn't leave, or maybe it was how she looked like them, tired, cold, but refusing to give up. They didn't say it, but they noticed. Every one of them did. She wasn't just their counselor anymore. She was proof that someone cared enough to stay through the dark. The night had grown colder, and the wind outside howled like a living thing, shaking the old windows of the shelter. Nora could barely feel her fingers anymore, but she kept writing, her flashlight casting a soft circle of light on the papers in front of her. Every few minutes, she would stop to rub her hands together or breathe into them for warmth, then continue as if nothing was wrong. The kids were still awake, some lying on the floor, others sitting up and whispering to each other. The teasing had stopped. Now they just looked tired, their laughter replaced with the quiet sound of the storm and the creak of the old building. Then through the silence, she heard footsteps. When she looked up, she saw two boys standing near her desk. They were the loud ones, the troublemakers, the kind who always had a smart remark ready. But now they looked different. Nervous, maybe even shy. One of them held a blanket in his hands, faded and torn at the corners. He shuffled his feet, avoiding her eyes. "You're cold," he said in a low voice, almost mumbling, and pushed the blanket toward her awkwardly. It wasn't much, just an old piece of cloth that had probably been in the shelter for years, but to them it was something. Nora paused, her heart warming despite the chill in the room. "Thank you," she said softly, smiling at them. The boy nodded quickly, as if he regretted being kind, and started to walk away. But before he could, Nora reached out and gently spread the blanket across the floor beside her chair. "Come sit," she said quietly. "You'll be cold, too." The boys hesitated, glancing at each other. One laughed nervously, muttering something about not wanting to, but she could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They didn't know how to respond to kindness. No one had ever invited them to share warmth before. Finally, one of them shrugged, dropped down to the floor, and pulled the edge of the blanket over his knees. The other followed a moment later, pretending it was no big deal. The room went quiet again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. The flashlight cast a soft glow around them, flickering gently against the walls. Nora kept writing her reports, pretending not to notice as the boys slowly relaxed beside her. Their hands stopped fidgeting. Their eyes grew heavy. Every so often, she caught them stealing glances at her, as if trying to understand why she hadn't taken the blanket for herself. Then something unexpected happened. A few of the other kids began to move closer too, dragging their own thin blankets across the floor. They didn't say anything, just quietly settled nearby one by one, until the small circle of light around Nora's desk was surrounded by sleepy faces. No one asked questions. No one laughed. They just sat together, sharing warmth in silence. The storm outside raged on, but inside the air felt softer. Nora looked up from her papers for a moment and took in the sight. The same kids who once shouted, mocked, and threw things were now sitting close, wrapped in the same worn blanket they had once fought over. She didn't say a word. She didn't want to break the moment. Instead, she just smiled faintly, adjusted the flashlight so its beam reached her notes better, and kept writing as if nothing unusual had happened. Time seemed to slow. The howling wind faded into the background, replaced by the quiet sound of breathing and the occasional rustle of fabric. The warmth of the shared blanket spread through the group like an invisible thread, connecting them in a way that no lecture or punishment ever could. Hours later, when most of the kids had drifted off to sleep right there on the floor, Nora stopped writing and leaned back. Her legs were stiff, her hands sore, but she didn't care. For the first time since she started working at the shelter, she felt the weight in the air lift. The walls that had once felt so heavy with anger and mistrust now seemed to hold something entirely new: peace. She looked down at the two boys still sitting close beside her, their heads drooping against the blanket. Quietly, she reached out and tucked the edges around them. They didn't stir, but one of them mumbled softly, half asleep. "Thanks." Nora smiled to herself. No one spoke again, but words weren't needed. In that cold, powerless room, surrounded by children who had been called too wild to save, warmth had finally found its way in. Something changed after that cold winter night, though no one said it out loud. It wasn't sudden like a movie scene, but quiet, the kind of change you only notice when you stop and look back. The next morning, when Nora walked into the common room, the kids didn't look away like they used to. Some nodded at her, others just watched silently, but there was a softness in their faces that hadn't been there before. It was small, but she saw it. For the first time, the walls between them had tiny cracks. Over the next few days, the teasing stopped. The smart remarks that once filled the air faded into awkward silence at first, then into real conversation. The shouting that used to echo down the halls wasn't gone completely. They were still kids learning to trust again. But now, when tempers rose, someone would take a deep breath instead of throwing something. Even the guards noticed it. The same kids who used to argue about everything now helped move chairs before group sessions, handed out notebooks, and even asked Nora if she needed help carrying boxes. It wasn't much, but to her, it felt like a miracle. The first real breakthrough came one afternoon when a boy who had barely spoken since she arrived raised his hand. "Can we talk about family stuff?" he asked, his voice hesitant. The room went silent. No one expected it. Nora nodded gently and said, "Of course." That day, they didn't talk about rules or discipline. They talked about homes, or the lack of them. One boy admitted he hadn't seen his mother in years. Another said he didn't even know where his father was. A girl spoke softly about her little sister, wondering if she still remembered her. The stories came out slowly, carefully, like fragile glass being set on the table. Nora didn't interrupt. She didn't offer advice or try to fix anything. She just listened. That became her greatest strength, the way she listened. Most adults who worked there wanted to correct, to lecture, to control. But Nora understood that these kids didn't need control. They needed to be heard. When they talked, she didn't fill the silence with words. She let them speak until they had nothing left to say, and sometimes that was enough. They began to see her differently, not as another authority figure, but as someone who actually cared what they felt. One evening, during a group session, a boy joked, "Hey, Miss Warmth, you gonna bring your blanket again if it gets cold?" The room erupted in laughter, but it wasn't mean laughter. It was real, light, and full of something new. The name stuck. They started calling her Miss Warmth half-jokingly, but she could tell they meant it. It wasn't just about that one night. It was about how she made them feel, safe, respected, and seen. From then on, Nora's sessions weren't just about behavior or lessons. They became a space for healing. The kids began to share their fears and dreams, even the ones they thought they'd buried long ago. One boy said he wanted to be a mechanic when he got out. A girl whispered that she wanted to draw again someday. They talked about things that had once felt impossible. And slowly, those impossible things began to sound real. Nora watched all of this unfold quietly, never taking credit. When other staff members asked her what she had done differently, she just smiled and said, "I stayed." She knew that was all it took sometimes, to stay long enough for someone to believe you won't leave. The shelter still had its rough days, but something lasting had changed. The laughter that once mocked her was now the sound of belonging. The anger that filled the halls was replaced with moments of calm. And every time she heard one of them call her Miss Warmth, it reminded her why she had never walked away. They didn't need a savior. They just needed someone who didn't give up on them. And in giving them warmth, she realized they had given her something just as powerful, proof that even the hardest hearts could learn to feel again. Months passed, and the shelter began to feel different, softer somehow, as if the walls themselves had learned to breathe again. The once chaotic halls now echoed with quieter sounds. pencils scratching on paper, low laughter, and the hum of music from an old radio. The fights that used to break out daily had almost disappeared. The guards, who once stood tense and watchful, now leaned against doorways, talking calmly with the kids. Even the air smelled different. Less like fear, more like life. It was on a bright spring morning that word spread through the building. The director was coming for an inspection. He hadn't visited in months, not since before Nora arrived. Most staff members braced themselves. They remembered his sharp eyes and short patience. He had once called the shelter a hopeless mess and said that if something didn't change soon, it might have to shut down. Nora had heard those stories too, but she didn't panic. She just went about her morning as usual, checking on her students and setting out supplies for their projects. When the director finally walked in, his expression was the same as always. Serious, unreadable. He stepped into the main room and paused. For a long moment, he said nothing. The kids, who usually fidgeted or whispered when visitors came, kept working quietly. One boy was sketching at the far table. A group of girls were cutting colored paper for a mural. Two others were writing essays about dreams after the storm, an idea Nora had given them. The room wasn't perfect. The furniture was still old, the walls still cracked, but there was warmth here now. It was the kind of peace that couldn't be bought or ordered. The director slowly walked around the room, his eyes scanning the walls. That's when he noticed it. A large poster taped near the back, drawn in crayon and marker. In bright, uneven letters, it read, "The Blanket Club, because she stayed." Around the words were small drawings. A flashlight, a tattered blanket, little hearts and stick figures sitting together under it. The director stopped in front of it for a long time. His usually stern face softened, and his hand brushed lightly against the paper as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He turned to Nora, who had been standing quietly near her desk, letting the kids have their moment. Their eyes met, and for once, he didn't look like the man who always measured success in reports and numbers. He looked human, humbled. "This is your doing?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Nora shook her head slightly. "No," she said softly, "it's theirs. I just stayed long enough for them to remember how to care." The director didn't reply right away. He looked around again, at the calm faces, the quiet laughter, the gentle way the kids treated each other now. These were the same young people he had once described as unreachable. Now they looked like any group of students, focused, alive, and hopeful. He exhaled slowly and said in a quiet voice, "You did what no one else could." For a moment, the room felt still. Some of the kids looked up, curious, but Nora only smiled politely and went back to helping a girl with her drawing. She didn't want attention or praise. That wasn't why she had come here. All she had ever wanted was to prove that broken things could be repaired, one small act of kindness at a time. As the director left, he stopped at the door and glanced back once more at the poster. There was something about the words, "because she stayed," that lingered in his mind long after he was gone. Later that day, he sent an email to the board recommending new funding for the shelter, calling it a place of true rehabilitation. But for Nora, the real success was simpler. When she looked at her students, she didn't see troubled kids anymore. She saw artists, writers, dreamers, and, for the first time, a family. That afternoon, as the sun streamed through the windows and laughter filled the air, Nora looked up at the poster again and whispered to herself, "They did what no one thought they could." And she knew she would carry that moment, that room full of quiet hope, for the rest of her life. Years had passed since that winter night in the shelter, but for Nora, it never really left her. Life had moved on. The kids had grown up, staff had changed, and the walls of the building had been repainted more than once. Nora now worked part-time, her hair streaked with gray, but her gentle spirit was the same. The shelter had become a quieter place, one filled with more laughter than shouting, more art than anger. Every so often she would look at the framed poster that still hung in her office, the one that read, "The Blanket Club," because she stayed. The colors had faded over time, but to her, It still glowed brighter than anything else in the room. It was on one snowy afternoon, much like that night years ago, that the letter arrived. The postmark was smudged, and the handwriting on the envelope was rough and uncertain, as if the writer hadn't written in a long time. Nora almost thought it was a mistake, until she saw the name at the bottom corner. Her heart caught for a moment. It was from one of them, one of her predator cubs, as the staff used to call them. She sat down at her desk, the light from the window falling across the paper, and carefully opened it. The letter wasn't long, but every word carried a weight she could feel. "Miss Warmth," it began. "I don't know if you remember me, but I was there that night. The night the power went out. You probably don't know what it meant. But when you tucked that blanket around us, something changed. That was the first time I felt safe in years. I stopped hating the world after that. I started believing that not everyone leaves." Nora read it twice, then a third time, her hands trembling just a little. By the time she finished, her eyes were wet, and she had to blink to keep the words from blurring. Outside, snowflakes had begun to fall softly, drifting past the window just as they had that long-ago night. The memory came rushing back, the flicker of the flashlight, the sound of the storm, the quiet breathing of the children beside her under that torn blanket. She remembered their faces, the way they slowly let their guard down, the way warmth replaced fear. She smiled through her tears, holding the letter close to her chest. She could almost hear his voice, older now, steadier, but still carrying a trace of that boy she once knew. She wondered where he was, what kind of life he had built. Maybe he had a family now, or maybe he was helping others the way she had helped him. The thought filled her with a quiet pride that words couldn't touch. Nora leaned back in her chair and looked out the window. The world outside was white and still. The same snow that once trapped her in the shelter now fell peacefully across the town. It reminded her how time could change everything, how broken things could heal, how lost souls could find their way back, how one small act of kindness could ripple outward for years. She placed the letter gently in a small wooden box in her drawer, alongside other keepsakes, a crayon drawing, a paper star, a faded photo of the old group. Each one carried a story, a reminder that even in the hardest places, goodness could take root. As the evening light dimmed, Nora whispered softly, almost to herself, "They made it!" Her voice trembled, but it was full of joy. She wasn't sure if any of them would ever fully understand how much they had changed her too. They had taught her that hope was never wasted, that even the smallest kindness could rebuild a life. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in quiet white. Somewhere out there, her once-lost cubs were grown now, no longer angry, no longer afraid, but carrying the warmth she had once shared with them. And as she watched the snow drift down, Nora thought to herself that this simple human connection was what it truly meant to save someone. Not by force, not by words, but by staying long enough to remind them what love feels like.